It is with the greatest sadness that I rise to say a few words. Prime Minister, it is with the greatest sadness that I rise to say a few words in tribute to Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth. Almost all of us in the House have experienced no other monarch, this country's throne, but Her late Majesty. There are indeed only a score or so members in this House who have already been born, let alone who can recall a time when she wasn't the Queen. She is wedded in our minds with the crown and all it stands for. After her accession in February 1952, she first came to the Palace of Westminster to open the session of Parliament in November 1952, when Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister and Speaker William Morrison was in the chair almost 70 years ago. 57 complete sessions of Parliament have passed since then, and as she was here to open all but 3 of them, as parliamentarians, we have celebrated with her for silver, golden, diamond jubilees, and of course marked her platinum jubilee this year, in which the lamp standards have been unveiled in New Palace Yard. In this place, her reign saw 10 different speakers occupy the chair. During her reign, there were 18 general elections, and I'm sure the Prime Minister will remind of us how many of her predecessors she welcomed to, and always, I am sure, with quiet wisdom. As the longest-serving monarch the country has known, she would have been assured of a notable entry in our history books, even were it not for the magnificence in which she undertook the role as Queen, but for a magnificent service, and what a service that entailed, not just as head of the nation, but head of the Commonwealth, head of the armed forces, and Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Over her reign, she has seen unprecedented social, cultural, technological change. Through it all, she was the most conscientious and dutiful of monarchs. But while she understood the inescapable nature of duty, which sometimes must have weighed upon her heavily, she also delighted in carrying it out, for she was the most devoted monarch. As well as Queen, she was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and great-grandmother, roles she carried out with the same sense of vocation as well as human kindness as the role of Queen. Her life, without unhappiness and troubles, but our memories of her will be filled with that image of a gently smiling dedication that showed throughout her life. Indeed, while this is a time of very considerable sadness, those memories of a noble, gracious lady who devoted her life to her family, the United Kingdom, and those nations around the world whom she served as Queen, will bring us some consolation and joy. My deepest sympathies are with His Majesty, the King, and other members of the royal family, to whom I commend all our sincere condolences and support at this very, very sad time. Order. We are meeting today for tributes to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth. I would like to inform the House that we will sit today until approximately 10 p.m. for tributes. At approximately 6 o'clock, the House will be suspended while His Majesty, the King, makes his broadcast to the nation. Members present will be able to watch the broadcast on screens in the chamber. We will then resume our proceedings to continue with tributes. The House will then sit again tomorrow at 1 o'clock. The first business will be oath-taking for a small number of senior members. Members to be invited to take the oath tomorrow are being contacted by my office. All other members will have an opportunity to take the oath when the House returns. After oath-taking tomorrow, tributes will be continued. The House is expected to sit till approximately 10 p.m. The House is not expected to sit on Sunday. I now call the Prime Minister, Liz Truss.
Mr. Speaker, in the hours since last night's shocking news, we have witnessed the most heartfelt outpouring of grief at the loss of Her late Majesty, the Queen. Crowds have gathered, flags have been lowered to half-mast, tributes have been sent from every continent around the world. On the death of her father, King George VI, Winston Churchill said the news had stilled the clatter and traffic of 20th century life in many lands. Now, 70 years later, in the tumult of the 21st century, life has paused again. Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, was one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. Yeah. She was the rock on which modern Britain was built. She came to the throne at just 25, in a country that was emerging from the shadow of war. She bequeaths a modern, dynamic nation that has grown and flourished under her reign. The United Kingdom is the great country it is today because of her. The Commonwealth is the family of nations it is today because of her. She was devoted to the union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. She served 15 countries as head of state, and she loved them all. Her words of wisdom gave us strength in the most testing times. During the darkest moments of the pandemic, she gave us hope that we would meet again. She knew this generation of Britons would be as strong as any. And as we meet today, we remember the pledge she made on her 21st birthday to dedicate her life to service. The whole House will agree, never has a promise been so completely fulfilled. Yeah. Her devotion to duty remains an example to us all. She carried out thousands of engagements. She took a red box every day. She gave her assent to countless pieces of legislation and was at the heart of our national life for 7 decades. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she drew on her deep faith. She was the nation's greatest diplomat. Her visits to post-apartheid South Africa and to the Republic of Ireland showed a unique ability to transcend difference and heal division. In total, she visited well over 100 countries. She met more people than any other monarch in our history. She gave counsel to prime ministers and ministers across government. I have personally greatly valued her wise advice. Only last October, I witnessed firsthand how she charmed the world's leading investors at Windsor Castle. She was always so proud of Britain and always embodied the spirit of our great country. She remained determined to carry out her duties, even at the age of 96. It was just 3 days ago at Balmoral that she invited me to form a government and become her 15th Prime Minister. Again, she generously shared with me her deep experience of government, even in those last days. Everyone who met her will remember the moment. They will speak of it for the rest of their lives. Even those who never met her, Her late Majesty's image is an icon for what Britain stands for as a nation, on our coins, on our stamps, and in portraits around the world. Her legacy will endure through the countless people she met, the global history she witnessed, and the lives that she touched. She was loved and admired by people across the United Kingdom and across the world. One of the reasons for that affection was her sheer humanity. She reinvented monarchy for the modern age. She was a champion of freedom and democracy around the world. She was dignified but not distant. She was willing to have fun, whether on a mission with 007 or having tea with Paddington Bear. She brought the monarchy into people's lives and into people's homes. During her first televised Christmas message in 1957, she said, "Today we need a special kind of courage, so we can show the world that we are not afraid of the future. We need that courage now." In an instant yesterday, our lives changed forever. Today, we show the world that we do not fear what lies ahead. We send our deepest sympathy to all members of the royal family. We pay tribute to our late Queen, and we offer loyal service to our new King. His Majesty, King Charles III, bears an awesome responsibility that he now carries for all of us. I was grateful to speak to His Majesty last night and offer my condolences. Even as he mourns, his sense of duty and service is clear. He has already made a profound contribution through his work on conservation, education, and his tireless diplomacy. We owe him our loyalty and devotion. The British people, the Commonwealth, and all of us in this House will support him as he takes our country forward to a new era of hope and progress, our new Carolean age. The crown endures, our nation endures, and in that spirit, I say, God save the King.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, our country, our people, this House, are united in mourning. Queen Elizabeth II was this great country's greatest monarch, and for the vast majority of us, it feels impossible to imagine a Britain without her. All our thoughts are with her beloved family, our royal family, at this moment of profound grief. This is a deep and private loss for them, yet it's one we all share, because Queen Elizabeth created a special personal relationship with us all. That relationship was built on the attributes that defined her reign: her total commitment to service and duty, her deep devotion to the country, the Commonwealth, and the people she loved. In return for that, we loved her. And it is because of that great shared love that we grieve today. For the 70 glorious years of her reign, our Queen was at the heart of this nation's life. She did not simply reign over us. She lived alongside us. She shared in our hopes and our fears, our joy and our pain, our good times and our bad. Our Queen played a crucial role as the thread between the history we cherish and the present we own. A reminder that our generational battle against the evil of fascism or the emergence of a new Britain out of the rubble of the Second World War do not only belong to the past, but are the inheritance of each and every one of us. A reminder that the creativity, the hard work, the enterprise that has always defined this nation is as abundant now as it ever was. A reminder that the prospect of a better future still burns brightly. Never was this link more important, that when our country was plunged into lockdown at the start of the pandemic, her simple message that we would see family again, that we would see friends again, that we would be together again, gave people strength and courage when they needed it most. But it wasn't simply the message that allowed a shaken nation to draw upon those reserves. It was the fact that she was the messenger. COVID closed the front doors of every home in the country. It made our lives smaller and more remote. But she was able to reach beyond that, to reassure us and steel us. At the time we were most alone, at a time we'd been driven apart, she held the nation close in a way no one else could have done. Yeah. For that, we say thank you. On the occasion of the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, Philip Larkin wrote of her reign, In times when nothing stood, but worsened or grew strange, there was one constant good: she did not change. It feels like we are once again in a moment in our history where, as Larkin put it, things are growing strange, where everything is spinning. A nation requires a still point. When times are difficult, it requires comfort. And when direction is hard to find, it requires leadership. The loss of our Queen robs this country of its stillest point, its greatest comfort, at precisely the time we need those things most. But our Queen's commitment to us, her life of public service, was underpinned by one crucial understanding: that the country she came to symbolise is bigger than any one individual or any one institution. It is the sum total of all our history and all our endeavours, and it will endure. The late Queen would have wanted us to redouble our efforts, to turn our collar up and face the storm, to carry on. Most of all, she would want us to remember that it is in these moments that we must pull together. This house is a place where ideas and ideals are debated. Of course, that leads to passionate disagreement. Of course, temperatures can run high. But we all do it in pursuit of something greater. We do it because we believe we can make this great country and its people greater still. At this moment of uncertainty, where our country feels caught between a past it cannot relive and a future yet to be revealed, we must always remember one of the great lessons of our Queen's reign: that we are always better when we rise above the petty, the trivial, the day-to-day, to focus on the things that really matter, the things that unite us, rather than those which divide us. Our Elizabethan age may now be over, but her legacy will live on forever. And as the children of that era, it falls upon us to take that legacy forward, to show the same love of country, the love of one another, as she did, to show empathy and compassion as she did, and to get Britain through this dark night and bring it into the dawn as she did. We join together today not just to say goodbye to our Queen, to share in our mourning, but to say something else important. God save the King, because as one era ends, so another begins. King Charles III has been a devoted servant of this country his entire life. He has been a powerful voice for fairness and understood the importance of the environment long before many others. As he ascends to his new role, with the Queen Consort by his side, the whole House, indeed the whole country, will join today to wish him a long, happy and successful reign. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the emotions we see across the nation today are echoed across the Commonwealth to which our Queen was so committed, in the church to which our Queen was so devoted, and in the armed forces which she led and her family served. Around the world, people will be united in mourning for her passing and united in celebrating her life. We've already seen beautiful tributes flow from across the world. It would be impossible to capture them all here. But each one is a reminder of the esteem in which she was held, of what she achieved on behalf of her country, of the shared values we treasure. The reason our loss feels so profound is not just because she stood at the head of our country for 70 years, but because, in spirit, she stood amongst us. As we move forward, as we forge a new path, as we build towards a better future, she will always be with us. For all she gave us and all she will continue to give us, we say thank you. May our Queen rest in peace. God save the King.
I now call on the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Constituents will wish me briefly to record their love, respect and gratitude to Her late Majesty. We can give continuing life to her values and virtues of kindness, aspiration, perseverance and pride. We thank her, we miss her, and we should say what she would wish: God save the King.
Yeah. I now call on the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, of course, with great sadness that we unite to offer our prayers, focus our sorrow, and gather our collective thoughts on the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. On behalf of the Scottish National Party, I would like to offer my condolences as we hold the Queen and her family in our thoughts and prayers at this difficult time. The grief and mourning which reverberates around this chamber and across the world will be all the more acute for the King and members of the royal family. Only they can understand the deep personal loss of a close family member, and people across society who have similarly lost loved ones will understand the pain that they must feel as we ensure our heartfelt condolences are with them today. Over the coming days, people up and down these islands will seek to come to terms in their own private way with the loss of one of the true constants in all our lives. In that regard, my thoughts are also with our own Prime Minister, just days into office, and having to come to terms with the enormity of the loss of the head of state and show the leadership that is now required in her position. We can also help but dwell on the late Queen, who right to the end fulfilled her duty by appointing the new Prime Minister. But of course, many will feel this as a deeply personal loss, for the Queen's continuous and abiding presence and the leadership she has shown over 7 decades will be the enduring marker to the remarkable tenure as our head of state. Her Majesty the Queen has been head of state for longer than most of us have been alive, and the majority of us have never known a public life without the Queen at the helm. For many, she has been a steady hand guiding the ship and the perpetual symbol of stability. 15 Prime Ministers and 5 First Ministers of Scotland have benefited from her institutional knowledge and, of course, her wise counsel. As the figurehead of the Commonwealth, she was a unifying force recognised the world over, visiting at least 117 countries, and was committed to celebrating the diverse values and cultures around the globe, all born out of a duty to serve. During her reign, the world has changed immeasurably, through the good times and the bad times, through war and peace, through boom and bust, through the advances in technology and communication and the dawn of the internet age. To many, she was a guiding light, ever present as she bore witness to the evolution of these islands into the modern era. A thread of continuity running through the fabric of the Commonwealth, at once tying societies to our shared histories and making new history. I, like many others in this chamber, was fortunate to meet the Queen on a number of occasions and was always struck by the strength, the intellect, the modesty, the humility, and often the humour with which she approached her royal duties. And while I have always met her in a professional context as monarch, I'm struck with just how many people across Scotland, and indeed across the United Kingdom, have had a first-hand encounter with the Queen. Whether they have been invited to her Holyrood garden parties or had the pleasure to meet with her in the many hundreds of events, walkabouts or official openings, including that at our Scottish Parliament, or whether she had taken them wholly by surprise with chance encounters on the countryside or villages near Balmoral, people the length and breadth of Scotland have their own tales of their individual meetings with the Queen. Because she was a monarch who reigned with compassion and integrity and established a deep connection with the public. And the affection which the Queen had for Scotland and that Scotland had for the Queen cannot be underestimated. On the Queen's first visit to Scotland following her coronation, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland said to her, "Today, you and I are Scotland, greeting with all that we have to offer of love and duty, our gracious young Queen." We can today look back on these words and say that for as long as Her Majesty reigned, both she and Scotland held true to these values of love and duty for one another. Speaking when she reconvened our Scottish Parliament in 1999, Her Majesty set out the obligation on members to set lasting standards of vision and purpose, of debate and discussion, not just for our own generation, but for future generations. And it is clear that members across the Scottish Parliament, and I trust in this place, from all walks of political life, have moved forward with that sense of vision and purpose in mind. There is a deeply held sense of responsibility across political parties to govern for the betterment of future generations. In our case, to uphold the values of the Scottish Parliament, which are described in the ceremonial mace: wisdom, justice, compassion and integrity. The values that set the aspirations for a modern Scotland, the values that so often embodied by Her Majesty herself. And in what was sadly her final ever address to the Scottish Parliament, her love of Scotland and its people was clear, when she said, "It is the people that make a place, and there are few places where this is truer than it is in Scotland." The relationship between Scotland and the Queen was one of shared admiration. Indeed, whilst she was everyone's Queen, for many in Scotland, she was Elizabeth, Queen of Scots. Her Majesty's roots in Scotland run deep. She was descended from the Royal House of Stuart on both sides, and her family, of course, her mother, was from Glamis and Angus. It is clear that these family ties gave way to a great and enduring affection, and Scotland was a place that was truly held dear to her, not only in an official capacity, but in a private capacity as well. It is well known that Balmoral, with its beautiful and atmospheric scenery, was the Queen's favourite home. Balmoral was a place where she was able to enjoy freedom, peace and the ability to indulge her love of the great outdoors, whether that was walking with her dogs, riding with horses, hosting picnics and barbecues, or from behind the wheel of her Land Rover. It is clear that Balmoral has been a place of peace and sanctuary for her throughout her whole life, and perhaps particularly so following the death of her husband, life companion and love, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. It is therefore perhaps fitting that she has met her final peace at Balmoral, a place where she found such enjoyment and comfort. And as someone of demonstrably strong faith, she will now have enduring peace with herself and, of course, to be reunited with Prince Philip. Her Majesty was a life of grace and wisdom, defined by its service to the public and by the lives that she touched. Her legacy and her enduring presence will live on. God bless the Queen. May she rest in peace. God bless the King.
Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the House will not mind if I begin with a personal confession. A few months ago, the BBC came to see me to talk about Her Majesty the Queen, and we sat down and the cameras started rolling, and they requested that I should talk about her in the past tense. And I'm afraid I simply choked up and I couldn't go on. I'm really not easily moved to tears, but I was so overcome with sadness that I had to ask them to go away. And I know that today there are countless people in this country and around the world who have experienced the same sudden access of unexpected emotion. And I think millions of us are trying to understand why we are feeling this deep and personal and almost familial sense of loss. Perhaps it's partly that she's always been there, a changeless human reference point in British life, the person who, all the surveys say, appears most often in our dreams, so unvarying in her pole star radiance that we have perhaps been lulled into thinking that she might be in some way eternal. But I think our shock is keener today because we are coming to understand in her death the full magnitude of what she did for us all. And think of what we asked that 25-year-old woman all those years ago. To be the person so globally trusted that her image should be on every unit of our currency, every postage stamp, the person in whose name all justice is dispensed in this country, every law passed, to whom every minister of the Crown swears allegiance, and for whom every member of our armed services is pledged, if necessary, to lay down their lives. Think what we asked of her in that moment. Not just to be the living embodiment in her DNA of the history and continuity and unity of this country, but to be the figurehead of our entire system, the keystone in the vast arch of the British state, a role that only she could fulfill because in the brilliant and durable bargain of the constitutional monarchy, only she could be trusted to be above any party political or commercial interest, and to incarnate impartially the very concept and essence of the nation. Think what we asked of her and think what she gave. She showed the world not just how to reign over a people, she showed the world how to give, how to love, and how to serve. And as we look back at that vast arc of service, its sheer duration is almost impossible to take in. She was the last living person in British public life to have served in uniform in the Second World War. She was the first female member of the royal family in 1,000 years to serve full-time in the armed forces, and that impulse to do her duty carried her right through into her 10th decade to the very moment in Balmoral, as my right honourable friend has said, only 3 days ago, when she saw off her 14th Prime Minister and welcomed her 15th, and I can tell you, in that audience, she was as radiant and as knowledgeable and as fascinated by politics as ever I can remember, and as wise in her advice as anyone I know, if not wiser. And over that extraordinary span of public service, with her naturally retentive and inquiring mind, I think, and doubtless many of the 15 would agree, that she became the greatest statesman and diplomat of all. And she knew instinctively how to cheer up the nation, how to lead a celebration. I remember her innocent joy more than 10 years ago after the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, when I told her that the leader of a friendly Middle Eastern country seemed actually to believe that she had jumped out of a helicopter in a pink dress and parachuted into the stadium. And I remember her equal pleasure on being told just a few weeks ago that she had been a smash hit in her performance with Paddington Bear. And perhaps more importantly, she knew how to keep us going when times were toughest. In 1940, when this country and this democracy faced the real possibility of extinction, she gave a broadcast, aged only 14, that was intended to reassure the children of Britain. She said then, "We know, every one of us, that in the end, all will be well." She was right. And she was right again in the darkest days of the COVID pandemic, when she came on our screens and told us that we would meet again. And we did. And I know I speak for other prime ministers when I say ex-prime ministers, when I say that she helped to comfort and guide us as well as the nation, because she had the patience and the sense of history to see that troubles come and go and that disasters are seldom as bad as they seem. And it was that indomitability, that humour, that work ethic and that sense of history which together made her Elizabeth the Great. And when I call her that, I should add one, Elizabeth the Great, I should add one final quality, of course, which was her humility. Her single-bar electric fire Tupperware using refusal to be grand. And unlike us politicians, with our outriders and our armour-plated convoys, I can tell you, as a direct eyewitness, that she drove herself in her own car with no detectives and no bodyguard, bouncing at alarming speed over the Scottish landscape to the total amazement of the ramblers and the tourists we encountered. And it is that indomitable spirit with which she created the modern constitutional monarchy. An institution so strong and so happy and so well understood, not just in this country, but in the Commonwealth and around the world, that the succession has already seamlessly taken place. And I believe she would regard it as her own highest achievement, that her son, Charles III, will clearly and amply follow her own extraordinary standards of duty and service. Yeah. And the fact that today we can say with such confidence, God save the King, is a tribute to him, but above all to Elizabeth the Great, who worked so hard for the good of her country, not just now, but for generations to come. That is why we mourn her so deeply. And it is in the depths of our grief that we understand why we loved her so much.
We now come to Mother of the House, Harriet Ham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and what an excellent speech from the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, which I'm sure will have resonated in every member of this House and indeed everyone in this country. It was a brilliant speech. I'm grateful for the opportunity to pay my tribute to the Queen and to do so on my own behalf, but also on behalf of my constituents, particularly those who, coming from Commonwealth countries in Africa and the Caribbean, held the Queen in such high regard. We're a constitutional monarchy, and for we MPs, the Queen was ever present in the interwoven relationship between the monarch and her Parliament. She underpinned our democratic system for over 70 years, underpinning it but never intervening in it. She was always salient but never meddled. She avoided controversy not by staying in the background, far from it. She performed her role to the utmost, but she did it by respecting the boundaries. She carried out her duties and gave us her full commitment for us to carry out ours. When many denigrated, she always respected and supported Parliament, and we should be very grateful for that. Between her ministers, and not just prime ministers, there was regular contact. After Labour won the election in 1997, I went up to the palace where, like the other new secretaries of state, she appointed me to the Privy Council and bestowed on me the seals of office. They are actual seals which are given to you and you take back to your department to be locked in a safe. But when just a year later I was sacked, and the seals taken out of the safe and taken back to Buckingham Palace, my diary was empty and my phone stopped ringing. My office was astonished to get a call from Buckingham Palace. No one else wanted to have anything to do with me, but the Queen wanted to see me. I was invited to take tea with the Queen for her to thank me for my service as Secretary of State. My point is that the relationship between our Queen and Parliament and our Queen and government was never just on paper, but was always active and always encouraging. She radiated British values of duty, patriotism, internationalism, charity and service. But while she embodied British values, she never intervened in politics. And that is constitutional alchemy, nothing less. It's evident that everyone, even those who don't agree with the hereditary principle of the monarchy, cannot but marvel at her personal qualities. And I want to marvel at how she could do all this flawlessly, not just over so many decades, but as a woman starting her reign in what was emphatically then a man's world. Yeah. We have to remember what attitudes were at the time. The order of the day was men were in charge and women were subservient. The man was head of the household, and the role of a woman was to get married, have his children, and support him. In the 1950s, when she was crowned, I was a child, and I remember my mother warning me that people thought men knew more than women, that men's views were valuable, whilst women's were to be disregarded. And so it was in that atmosphere that she stepped up as a 25-year-old married woman with 2 children to take her place at the head of this nation and play a huge role on the world stage. What determination and courage that must have taken. Yeah. The prime ministers she dealt with were mostly men, mostly twice her age. Things were very different. A huge change has taken place during her reign. Things were very different when 6 years ago she threw open Buckingham Palace for us to celebrate the 70th anniversary of BBC's Women's Hour, to celebrate how much women had achieved. As Sir Tony Blair said, she was the matriarch of this nation, a matriarch for us on the world stage, and a matriarch too at home in her own family. As well as being our monarch, she was the mother of 4 children, had many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and it is to her family that I extend my deepest sympathies for their loss and condolences for their grief, which we all share.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great sadness that I rise to pay tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on my behalf and on behalf of my Maidenhead constituents. Yesterday was a day that we all knew would come sometime, but in our hearts of hearts we hoped never would. But as we mourn a beloved monarch, we must always remember that she was a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with King Charles III and the whole of the royal family. Yeah. And I also remember the close members of her royal household. Queen Elizabeth II was quite simply the most remarkable person I have ever met. I am sometimes asked, among all the world leaders I met, who was the most impressive? And I have no hesitation in saying that from all the heads of state and government, the most impressive person I met was Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She gave a lifetime of service as she promised to do when she was 21. Her selfless devotion to duty was an inspiration and example to us all. She was respected and loved, not just here in the United Kingdom and in her other realms and the Commonwealth, but across the world. And that love, respect, and admiration was born not out of her position, but because of the person she was. A woman of dignity and grace, of compassion and warmth, of mischief and joy, of wisdom and experience, and of a deep understanding of her people. Like so many until last evening, I had never known another monarch. She was a constant throughout our lives, always there for us, uniting us at times of difficulty, and as others have said, most recently during COVID, when she gave us hope that we would once more come together. Her passing marks a generational change, not just because of the length of her service, but because of what she lived through. When we marked the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings in 2019, she was with the world leaders not just as Queen, but as someone who had worn uniform during the Second World War, an experience which, quite apart from anything else, had taught her how to strip an engine. The Queen was always interested in people. When she walked into a room, the faces of those present were lit up, and her magnificent smile would calm nerves and put people at their ease. As I said on her Platinum Jubilee, I saw that at Chogham in 2018, when there was a reception at Windsor before a lunch, and the leaders were gathered and talking amongst themselves, and I knew Her Majesty was going to join the reception, but they didn't. The minute she walked into the room, the sense of love and respect was palpable, and they all turned and they all wanted to speak to her. They loved her and she loved the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth today is a significant part of her legacy. But I also saw that on other occasions, including on what was one of her last, if not the last, appearance she made in public, when she came to open Thames Hospice in my Maidenhead constituency in July. The moment she walked through the door, the atmosphere in the room changed. You felt the love and respect of the people there for her. And as she spoke to staff and patients, she exuded a warmth and humanity which put people at their ease. She was Queen, but she embodied us. Across the nations of the world and for so many people, meeting Queen Elizabeth simply made their day, and for many will be the memory of their life. Of course, for those of us who had the honour to serve as one of her prime ministers, those meetings were more frequent with the weekly audiences. These were not meetings with a high and mighty monarch, but a conversation with a woman of experience and knowledge and immense wisdom. They were also the one meeting I went to, which I knew would not be briefed out to the media. What made those audiences so special was the understanding the Queen had of issues which came from the work she put into her red boxes, combined with her years of experience. She knew many of the world leaders. In some cases, she had known their fathers. And she was a wise and adroit judge of people. The conversations at the audiences were special, but so were weekends at Balmoral, where the Queen wanted all her guests to enjoy themselves. And she was a thoughtful hostess. She would take an interest in what books were put in your room, and she didn't always expect to be the centre of attention. She was quite happy sometimes to sit playing her form of patience, while others were mingling around her, chatting to each other. My husband tells of the time he had a dream. He dreamt that he was sitting in the back of a Range Rover being driven around a Balmoral estate, and the driver was Her Majesty the Queen, and the passenger's seat was occupied by his wife, the Prime Minister. And then he woke up and realised it was reality. Her Majesty loved the countryside, and she was down to earth and a woman of common sense. I remember one picnic at Balmoral which was taking place in one of the bothies on the estate. The hampers came from the castle and we all mucked in to put the food and drink out on the table. I picked up some cheese, put it on a plate and was transferring it to the table. The cheese fell on the floor. I had a split-second decision to make. I picked up the cheese, put it on the plate and put it on the table. And I turned round to see that my every move had been watched very carefully by Her Majesty the Queen. I looked at her, she looked at me, and she just smiled. And the cheese remained on the table. This is indeed a sad day, but it is also a day of celebration of a life well spent in the service of others. There have been many words of tribute and superlatives used to describe Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, but these are not hype. They are entirely justified. She was our longest-serving monarch. She was respected around the world. She united our nation in times of trouble. She joined in our celebrations with joy and a mischievous smile. She gave an example to us all. of faith, of service, of duty, of dignity, of decency. She was remarkable, and I doubt we will ever see her like again. May she rest in peace and rise in glory.
Sir Ed Davey.
It's a real pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady, and can I congratulate her on her lovely, heartwarming speech. Mr. Speaker, Liberal Democrats join members from all sides of the House in expressing our deepest condolences on the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. We are mourning a profound loss. The Queen was a formidable monarch who faithfully served our country for all her life and was loved the world over. She represented not only duty and courage, but warmth and compassion, and she was a living reminder of our collective past, of the greatest generation and their sacrifices for our freedom. For many people, myself included, Her Majesty was an ever-fixed mark in our lives. As the world changed around us and politicians came and went, she was our nation's constant. In challenging times, she was always a source of calm and comfort. And she tied our nations together, embodying an unwavering pride in our country, showing us that patriotism is not defined by political allegiance, and reminding us of the many things that bind us all together, even when it doesn't always feel that way. We saw this so vividly during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June. I'm proud to represent the oldest royal borough in England, Kingston-upon-Thames. And our Jubilee Street parties certainly lived up to that status. It was truly wonderful to see such an outpouring of affection from people across Kingston from all walks of life. School children who baked Jubilee cakes, neighbours who shared bunting, choirs who sang hymns of praise. And it was incredibly fitting, wasn't it? That after so long kept apart by COVID, it was the Queen and a celebration of Her Majesty's reign that brought our communities back together so joyfully. Just as the whole country is united today, so sadly, in grief. The deep mourning across the country now, just like the celebrations of her Jubilee a few months ago, comes not from a sense of duty, but from genuine and heartfelt affection, love, and admiration of Her Majesty. It was not because we were her subjects, but because she was truly our Queen. What she meant to us is perhaps best summed up by a phrase on so many people's lips over the last 24 hours. I can't imagine our country without her. For almost everyone in our country, she has been there our whole lives. Times of national grief and national jubilation, she has never not been there for us. So it's hard to accept that she is gone, and hard to see how we go on without her. But we will. Our great United Kingdom has a great future, because the Queen's spirit of strength, grace and resolve lives on in her people. One of the greatest privileges of being a member of this House was the chance to meet Her Majesty. Like when she visited Kingston on the occasion of her Golden Jubilee, or when I was deeply privileged to sit next to her at lunch at Windsor Castle. I was initially confused by a silver cylinder beside her place-sitting. I wondered to myself what treasures it might hold. I had my suspicions when, as dessert was served, her beloved corgis were let in and nestled themselves around her feet. And the Queen lifted up the lid of the cylinder, plucked out some digestive biscuits, and began sneaking them to her grateful dogs. Whenever I met her, I was struck by her warmth, her wisdom, and her humour. And I'm looking forward to hearing similar stories from honourable and right honourable members across the House as they give glimpses of the wonderful person beneath the crown. Her Majesty will be remembered with honour as a monarch who guided our country out of the shadow of a terrible war, who helmed us calmly through troubled waters and brought us safely into a new millennium. and she will be remembered so fondly as the monarch who leapt from a helicopter with James Bond and showed Paddington where she kept her marmalade sandwiches. And for the royal family, she will be remembered simply as a beloved mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Our thoughts, prayers, and condolences are with them all as they bear this terrible loss. After a lifetime of dedicated and tireless service to our country and our Commonwealth, Her Majesty has gone to her eternal rest. May God rest her soul, and may God save the King.
Yeah. Now come to Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful. So much has already been said. I don't intend to repeat it much, but I just want to say that it is a sad day for all of us. It's tragic news, bringing to the end a remarkable career spanning 70 years, endless prime ministers and endless leaders of the opposition too. But for those 70 years, Her Majesty carried out her duties with charm, humility, not often mentioned, real humility, and also endless humour. She was quite remarkable in a way, and she learnt that from somebody that we haven't mentioned today, her father, who in his own way, someone who never expected in a way to be the monarch, who suffered a very significant problem in a speech impediment, and yet he showed her that it was possible to rise above the challenge and to deliver your service to your country at an incredible time. And that service and duty, there is no question she learnt at the knees of her father, overcoming his own difficulties and putting his country and their service first, something quite often forgotten about. And a couple of things that come to mind, because in fact so often we've taken Her Majesty for granted. We expect her to be there. The way the crowds, whenever anything is good or bad in our country, they gather at Buckingham Palace, whether she's there or she was there or not there. They gathered. It was almost as though they could touch the railings and draw some succor or some support or some sort of mystical help. And there they were again last night in pouring rain outside Buckingham Palace. Well, quite often in all of that, Mr. Speaker, we often forgot that she was also a human being with her own family issues and problems. And I remember particularly during that period when two of her sons were facing marriage breakups, which were being widely reported in the newspapers, in the media, with everybody speculating in public about all that was going on. I wonder how many in this House could ever have borne something like that in such public domain, such a sad tragedy for their mother. And then, to top it all, Windsor Castle burns down, a place she loved deeply and felt responsible for. And nobody seemed to take her in a way into consideration until when she approached a speech with an interesting cold, and she said that the year for her had been her annus horribilis. I think the public stopped. We all paused and we realized, actually, that we had forgotten that we owe as much duty and service to her as she had shown us without complaint. I thought that was a remarkable moment, really, when the country came back from where it was to recognize that duty and service. And the other was when Diana, then Princess of Wales, tragically died in that terrible car accident. And everybody again gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and they demanded that the Queen should come. It got more and more shrill, with the newspapers banging on about how she had to come back. But there she was in Balmoral, trying to do what almost any single mother, grandmother wanted to do, which is to put her arms around her grandchildren, comfort them, and protect them from what she knew was going to descend upon them. And finally, when she came down, I grew to the realization that actually It wasn't that they were angry that she wasn't there. It was that the British public needed her there to be able to show their own emotion, as she was the focus for all of that. And when she came, everybody cheered and applauded because she was there, and now they could grieve properly because she was the focus for that grief. And of course we have anecdotes about what we did, and I remember when I had ceased being leader of the Conservative Party, it happens quite a lot, really. I think she was pretty used to it, actually.
Yes.
But she kindly asked me to take leave of her officially, which I thought was pretty kind, really. As said earlier on, nobody else wanted me to do it, so it was decent of her to do it. And I remember when I came to the palace and I was ushered into her drawing room, small personal sitting room, I was struck by two or three things. One was the 2-bar electric fire, which had a very strange piece of cardboard cut out in the shape of flames, coloured with crayons, I suspect by somebody in the palace, yellow and red, surrounding the 2-bar fire, which I thought was peculiarly dangerous, but notwithstanding that, I'm sure it had a purpose. The other one was the Tupperware radio sitting next to her, which I hadn't seen since my parents smashed their last one. And then she very sweetly asked me how I was, being clearly sympathetic about what had happened. And I just shrugged and said, "Well, ma'am, nobody died and I'm still here." Whereupon she roared with laughter, and the funny thing was, as she did, she paused, looking at me, not sure whether I'd actually made a joke or whether I'd not. I laughed too, and then she laughed again. Whether at me or with me, I couldn't figure that out. That was something to relish. And the other anecdote I just wanted to share with the House for a second was slightly different. It was when I was in one of those Privy Councils, and for some reason we were offered drinks to have at the end of the Privy Council. Didn't happen very often, so I took full advantage and ordered a whiskey. And while we had finished the Privy Council, she came round to talk to those of us in the Privy Council and chat. And she came to me, and like everybody else, nervous as anything, I stumbled through, and then I said, "Oh, ma'am, I remember I'd just been reading some stuff about one of Churchill's speeches, and I suddenly recalled something that he had said at the time. It was 1941, and President Roosevelt had sent a note over with the person that he had just defeated in his third election. And in it, as Churchill said, he had written in his own hand a verse from Longfellow. Now remember, in 41, we didn't know whether we would survive or not. And Churchill read it out, and I started to speak it, and she started speaking it as well. And I just want to share it with the House. It was, sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all its hopes for future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate. She said it perfectly. She smiled slightly, and I did detect a little dampness in her eye, and then she moved on. And in a way, it suddenly struck me that that was exactly her. She was the ship of state. We look to her for everything, good and in difficult times. She loved the Union with a passion. And she loved Scotland, I think probably most of all. The track was, that was who she was. She was that ship of state, and somehow we have too often taken her for granted. But she has never complained, and she always gave us service. And now for that union of hearts, if the House would indulge me, I want to quote from W.H. Auden with a few changes. Stop all the clocks, cut out the telephones, prevent the dogs from barking with the juicy bone, silence the piano, and with muffled drums, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. She was our north, our south, our east and west, our working week and our Sunday rest, our noon, our midnight, our talk, our song. We thought that love would last forever. We were wrong. May God bless her and keep her and hold her in her hands. And may we bless the royal family. God save the King.
I'm now going to bring Sir Geoffrey Donaldson in, but can I just warn others that I would hope to get so many in today that please, if we can use up to 3 minutes after Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. Sir Geoffrey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of my colleagues in the Democratic Unionist Party and on behalf of many across Northern Ireland, I wish to offer our sincere sympathy to His Majesty the King and to other members of the royal family on the passing of our dear Sovereign, Queen Elizabeth II. In counties Antrim and Armagh, Down and Fermanagh, Londonderry and Tyrone, individuals and families will gather in their communities to remember a great monarch, a monarch who stood with us in our time of trouble. Her Majesty the Queen has been a steadfast and unshakable head of state for the United Kingdom and for the Commonwealth, and her gracious approach has been, as others have said, a constant throughout our lives. In 1952, during her first Christmas broadcast, Queen Elizabeth asked the nation to pray, and I quote, that God may give me wisdom and strength to carry out the solemn promises I shall be making, and that I may faithfully serve Him and you all the days of my life. She certainly fulfilled her promises. And today we mourn her passing. But we do so with tremendous honour for one who served God and her people faithfully. Her Majesty led by example in Northern Ireland and reached out the hand of friendship to help with the reconciliation process. We are duty bound to build on that foundation. The royal visit to the Republic of Ireland in 2011 was groundbreaking, and the warmth with which Her Majesty was received demonstrated that she was revered and respected far beyond this United Kingdom. I remember with fondness her speech during that visit, where she again referred to her Christian convictions and reminded us that forgiveness lies at the heart of her faith and that it can reconcile divided communities. Her visits to my own constituency in Lagan Valley, to the city of Lisburn, to Dromore, and of course to Royal Hillsborough, invoke precious memories for the residents and for all of us. And I know that her death will be felt acutely in Hillsborough and in the surrounding communities. During the most traumatic of days of our troubled past in Northern Ireland, Her Majesty visited with us many times to show solidarity with her people in their darkest of hours. Her presence conveyed a deep sense of stability and offered hope to so many. One such visit was in 1976, in one of the most violent years of the Troubles. In her Christmas address later that year, Her Majesty spoke of the need for an end to the conflict and pointed the way to peace and reconciliation. She reminded us that the following year was her Silver Jubilee and expressed in hope that, and I quote, "The gift I would most value next year is that reconciliation should be found wherever it is needed. A reconciliation which would bring peace and security to families and neighbours at present suffering and torn apart." Yet just a few short years later, Her Majesty too was touched by the violence of the Troubles, and her family endured the hurt and the deep pain of losing a loved one following the assassination by the IRA of the Earl Mountbatten at Mullaghmore in County Sligo in August 1979. She shared the sense of loss felt by countless victims, and her empathy and understanding offered comfort to so many from all backgrounds. She rose above that sense of loss to reach out across divided communities in Northern Ireland and to offer hope. This is real leadership. Yet it took us almost 20 long years to complete our journey to a peace agreement. An agreement that offered the prospect of bringing about that reconciliation that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth yearned to see. Some 25 years on from that agreement, in truth, Mr. Speaker, we still struggle to deal with the legacy of our troubled past. Your Majesty, on an island riven by conflict and division, you were a bridge builder, reaching out to those from opposite sides of the divide, and your work of reconciliation helped to heal wounds and to encourage change. Your historic visit to the Republic of Ireland was a cathartic moment in British-Irish relations. The way you conducted yourself, the language you used, and the message that you brought helped to lay to rest many of the ghosts of our shared history that have cast their shadows over relationships on these islands for centuries. It is my hope that your passing and the example you set will inspire us to even greater heights and to complete the journey that will bring true healing and reconciliation to our troubled land. Your Majesty, this United Kingdom has been truly blessed to have you as our head of state, a sovereign whose dignified and faithful service has inspired a nation. I can do no better than quote the words of a book that contains the values you sought to uphold throughout your reign. Well done, good and faithful servant. Our United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is stronger for your reign. And to His Majesty King Charles III, I say this: we must all work to build this kingdom, that it is even stronger and more united. And we on this side will use all our endeavours to achieve these objectives. God save the King.
Speaker, I associate with many of the very passionate comments that we have heard already this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and there have been many thousands of moving and heartfelt tributes from across the world. Our Queen was loved, cherished, respected and admired for her deep devotion to public service and to the people. And of course we meet in circumstances that we all knew would happen one day, but of course none of us wanted to see. And Mr. Speaker, it was so poignant yesterday that the heavens opened and cried with the country as the devastating news broke that this period of national mourning began. For most of us, if not all in this chamber, and of course people across the country and the Commonwealth and across the world, not only knew our Queen as the head of state, one sovereign, a lady, one monarch. And the late Queen Elizabeth II's life was one that of course was dedicated to public service but was deeply, deeply inspiring. And of course she held that dignified presence, that ability, the charisma that this House has heard so much of already this morning, to lead our nation through dark periods, but also through the most joyous moments that we have celebrated as a country. And of course, from the horrors in the world wars to the fears of the pandemic, she was one who never ever faltered in her duty. And of course, as my right honourable friend has already said, she was that rock, but she was there as that model of assurance, that pillar that would give us the strength and support that we would need through the darkest times. But of course, Mr. Speaker, for each and every one of us and for all of our constituents in particular, a royal visit was one of the most joyous moments and occasions that we would all celebrate. They were wonderful, they were memorable, they were great events, and in particular when the visitor, of course, was Her Majesty the Queen. And a few months after my election to Parliament in 2010, I, of course, witnessed that excitement, when Her Majesty the Queen visited that very famous village of Tiptree in the Witham constituency, where the royal warrant told in Wilkin & Sons jam makers to mark their 125th anniversary. The affection and warmth that was shown towards Her Majesty, of course, was astonishing to see. Not astonishing to see, I should say. And, of course, Queen Elizabeth reciprocated, where she touched everyone's hearts, taking the time to see everyone, to speak to everyone as well. Also, when including the famous inspections of the world-famous jams, including the production lines of the Christmas puddings that so many people in this house in particular have recently enjoyed. And of course, despite those huge undertakings year after year, each and every person that she touched felt special, and that was a tremendous mark of her own humility. And that day, now nearly 12 years ago, remains fresh in the minds of my constituents who are mourning, sadly, with the entire nation today. And of course, it's not just royal visits that marked Her Majesty and gave us all that moment of excitement to have seen Her Majesty the Queen. For those of us that enjoy horses, and enjoy racing in particular, she herself was well known across not just the country, but also around the world for her love and passion of horses. Whether it was the famous visits to Ascot or Epsom, the Derby itself, all of those who attended wanted to just snip that moment with her, to get that glimmer, hoping to get that royal wave, or recent a famous racing tip as well. And of course, no one did more to champion horse racing in this country than the late Queen. She loved the sport, she loved her horses, and in return, the whole racing industry loved her and will miss her enormously. Her late Majesty led a remarkable life, Mr. Speaker, and delivered an era and reign that will stand out as being the most magnificent in the long and great history of our nation. As we mourn the end of her 70th year reign, we commemorate the great life that she lived and, of course, the long service, the distinguished service that she gave to our country. We reflect on the importance of the monarch in our public life, of course, and at this particular time, a moment in time, our thoughts and prayer are naturally with her family. And we offer our wholehearted support and, of course, our commitment to the King, King Charles III. In the years ahead, while the faces on our notes and coins and stamps will, of course, change, Her late Majesty will always occupy a special place and an affectionate in the hearts of our nation. God rest her soul, and God save the King.
Dame Margaret Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard it said that on occasions like this, most of us talk about ourselves, and that's inevitable because we're talking about the links we have in our memories with the person who is gone. But I think perhaps I'm one of the few in this house who does remember when the Queen's father died. I must admit my memories are twofold. First, how surprised I was that people thought 25 was young. And secondly, that when she came to the throne, we all got a bar of chocolate. I first encountered Her Majesty at One Remove, soon after I was first elected to this House in October 1974, and I do recognise that many honourable members here were not born then. By 1975, I was a junior government whip. We had a small majority and a large legislative programme. And there was a duty that usually fell to a very senior whip, one of writing every day, by hand, direct to Her Majesty the Queen to tell her what was happening in her Parliament. I was told this had probably originated with the first Prime Minister who wrote to the King to tell him what was happening in the House. And I was asked to undertake this duty to help my colleague. It seemed to me, I was told, by the way, this is very important, that this was a personal message from a member of the government to Her Majesty for her eyes only. That is relevant. It seemed to me that there was very little point in telling her the things she knew from her red box, or that she had read probably in the chat column in the Daily Telegraph. So what I wrote to her about was the stuff that I thought she wouldn't get from either of those sources. I wrote to her about the gossip in the tea. Occasionally slightly edited. And I wrote to her about the rows that people were having behind the scenes in committee rooms or in corridors. There was no feedback, but there wasn't any rebuke either. But then a day came when the Queen went on an overseas visit. Now, I knew, of course, that official correspondence always goes through official channels when the Queen is out of the country. But I was a very new MP, and I thought that something that was marked from me personally to the Queen personally, that no one would have the impertinence to read that. Some busybody in number 10, however, did. Perhaps a little unfortunately, and not unknown to members in this House, there was something of a dispute going on at the time about the issue of our relationship with the European Community. And I told the Queen what we thought about it and what we were saying about it and where I thought the ministers of the day were sometimes getting it wrong. And the House may not be surprised to learn, I will not sully your ears, but there's a short, pithy phrase, that common usage, that encapsulates really exactly what happened next. But suffice it to say that I was summoned to the Chief Whip, and after a brief and spirited discussion, the job returned to the person to whom it originally was. It was many years later, but rather typically, that I heard very indirectly and subtly that perhaps Her Majesty had slightly regretted a return to normal service. And I thought that was comforting. I was pleased about that. It was many years later, after a short involuntary break in my service in this House, that I returned for my present constituency, where we have had the great honour to entertain Her Majesty on many occasions, not least in everybody's memory, when she opened our new football stadium and indeed our brand new hospital, to which she was gracious enough to agree we could give the title of the Royal Derby Hospital, in which it rejoices to this day. And over the years, 3 years, for example, as President of the Council, I was fortunate enough to have many encounters with Her Majesty and can absolutely endorse everything that has been said and will be said, no doubt, about her intelligence, her awareness, and her attitudes. I was also fortunate enough to be present after the death of our colleague John Smith at the commemoration of D-Day on the 50th anniversary, and to be in the Queen's company and observe her and her utter respect for the veterans and for the sacrifice of those days over that period. But as I say, I had many encounters with her as President of the Council, and indeed, as Foreign Secretary, accompanied her on state visits where, like the Right Honourable Lady, the former Prime Minister, I heard, for example, her observations about the comments made to her by the mother of a former president about the then present incumbent, and very interesting it was. So I would just testify to the qualities of which everyone else has spoken, and to which I'm sure everyone else will give testimony, of her intelligence, her knowledge, her sense of humour. One of my abiding and favourite memories is fairly, not very recently, but of recent years. People will probably recall it's often been on the news. It's one of my favourite clips of, I think, the Duke of Edinburgh was being chased by a persistent bee, and there's a picture of the Queen coming through an archway, giggling uncontrollably, and clearly quite unable to suppress how hysterically funny she found it. And I think that very much sums up the person that you could see and admire. She was a remarkable person, a remarkable monarch, and we are the poorer for her going.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Often this place can be criticised for the debates we have, but I think it has risen to the occasion today in memory of the late Her Majesty the Queen, and the contributions from all sides of the House show the heartfelt thoughts of members who have had close experience and those of us who have met the Queen very infrequently. I met the late Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth at the opening of the Scottish Parliament last year, and I had a short conversation with her as the leader of the main opposition party, and she moved on to the other party leaders. But I have a picture of the Queen shaking my hand with the beaming smile that we saw in her last picture that was taken at Balmoral on Tuesday. And Her Majesty the Queen loved Scotland, and Scotland loved Her Majesty the Queen. And I think it is right that that picture, it was taken by an excellent Scottish photographer, Jane Barlow, who captured Her Majesty looking very calm, very happy, and very at home in Balmoral, which she loved. I also want to speak briefly on behalf of my constituents in Moray who enjoyed meeting the Queen on many occasions. The most recent visit, and her last visit to Moray, was in November 2014, when she arrived on the Royal Train at Elgin train station, and she went to meet our armed forces at RAF Lossiemouth and at Kinloss Barracks. Because it has been mentioned today, but the armed forces are important and were important to Her Majesty and are important to King Charles III and will play an extremely important role in the coming days and weeks. But that visit in November 2014 was accompanied with the late Duke of Edinburgh, and it was their 67th wedding anniversary, and it showed that the public commitment to service and the dedication of both Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, it meant that they went about their duties when others would be celebrating a milestone anniversary. But that was what the Queen provided: commitment and dedication at every opportunity to deliver for people across the country. We will, over the next few days and weeks, remember that commitment from Her Majesty the Queen, and we will, in our thoughts and our prayers, think about King Charles III and the royal family, who are grieving the loss of a loving mother, grandmother and great-grandmother. But as we join together to grieve and mourn, we also unite to give thanks and to celebrate a life well lived, to celebrate a life committed and dedicated to public service, a life which has shone a light throughout the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth and around the world. And the tributes we've heard in this place today and from leaders across the globe show the respect rightly held for the late Her Majesty the Queen. May she rest in peace, and God save the King.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think probably unlike every previous speaker, I only met the Queen once, and that was when she visited, appropriately enough, the Queen's Theatre in Hornchurch, which was then my constituency. And when she left, she went on, as she always did, to go from strength to strength. I left to be ejected from Parliament by the voters at the following election, who had slightly different experiences after her visit. As the leader of the Liberal Democrats has said, it's difficult to imagine the world without her, and that's absolutely true. But it's worth remembering something that is very rarely remembered, and that is that in 1936, after the abdication crisis, the monarchy teetered on the brink. And according to most polls at that time, most British voters thought the monarchy might not survive for very long. Now, since 1945, the monarchy has been the most popular institution in Britain and has polled something like 80%. There's no institution that's polled anything like that level of popularity over such a sustained period of time. Now, that's not an accident. It happened for two reasons, both because the Queen and her father, George VI, had that iron dedication to public service, which possibly started in the most spectacular way when George VI decided to remain in London during the war, instead of following the advice to leave London and go elsewhere, perhaps even to Canada, as one advisor told him. That started then, but the second reason is that both George VI and Elizabeth II had an absolutely clear understanding of the constitutional parameters of the role of the monarchy, and neither of them ever strayed outside that role. And in the case of the Queen, despite repeated attempts to pull her into political controversies, including the first one I can remember was in 1974. We had a hung parliament, and there was article after article in the press in those days saying that the Queen should intervene, should pull the parties together, the two big parties, perhaps the three big parties, to form some sort of coalition government, and she refused to do it. And she was absolutely right to refuse to do it. And she was persistent in that all the way through. And that's her great legacy, that the monarchy has survived as that popular institution because she observed those absolutely correct constitutional parameters. And I think we can all hope that if the new king, as I'm sure he will, observes those parameters and has that dedication to public service which he's already demonstrated, he can reunite and draw together a nation which is as bitterly divided as I can remember.
Dame Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today was strange to wake up to the first day without our much-loved and hugely respected Queen Elizabeth II. There is a sense of personal loss as well as shock. Somehow her long years of service, commitment and duty felt as if they would never come to an end. As one of the older members of my family told me just this morning, things changed so much in her and our lifetime, and sometimes we feel hopelessly out of date and rather uncomfortable. She was our figurehead, and for that we are truly grateful. The Queen's reign was somehow timeless. Listening back this morning to her first televised Christmas broadcast in 1957, and then to her broadcast to the nation during COVID, Queen Elizabeth II proved continuity right from the post-war years through 15 different prime ministers, from Sir Winston Churchill to my right honourable friend, the member for South West Norfolk, and to the extraordinary, heartwarming royal digital performances with James Bond and with Paddington Bear. For me, her handbag will now always contain a marmalade sandwich. I always remember being sworn in as a Privy Councillor. It was the same day as my right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, and we were given the usual briefing on how you kneel on a footstool with your right your right hand by your side, your left hand holding a Bible, and my right honourable friend and I looked at each other and we were like, what if you fall off your footstool? And we were told very straight-faced, don't worry, the Queen will find it very amusing, which we didn't find reassuring, but luckily it didn't happen. As Lord President of the Council during the hung Parliament of 2017 to 2019, I had the honour of regular audiences with the Queen ahead of Privy Council meetings. On those occasions, I was always struck by the warmth of the welcome and the frankness of the conversation. The Queen was always interested to hear updates on the progress of legislation and the mood of the House. She was very well informed and also quite challenging at a time of extraordinary events, from Brexit to Donald Trump's visit to behaviour scandals here in Westminster. Once a year, the leaders of the Commons and Lords would be invited to Windsor Castle for lunch with the Queen and Prince Philip. These occasions felt quite overwhelming, but at the same time, after a pre-lunch drink in the sitting room and getting into a conversation about how well the restoration of Windsor Castle was presided over by Prince Philip compared to our own efforts to restore the Palace of Westminster, Baroness Evans of Bowes Park and I were very soon distracted as we sought to defend the indefensible. A happy memory for me is going to Sandringham for Privy Council 1 January, with log fires burning and the Queen's corgis pottering around. I recall the Queen saying what a very busy Christmas she'd had, and I suggested, well, at least her family don't need to pause Christmas lunch for the Queen's speech, at which she told me they most certainly did. As for all of us, her family would pause lunch and watch the Queen's speech, and Princess Charlotte had run over to the TV screen and said, look, there's Gangan. Very heartwarming. At each of the audiences, it would strike me anew that Privy Council meetings were just one of the many daily duties of the Queen, and that her cheerfulness and her twinkling eyes were always a constant. Truly, she was a monarch who put the comfort of others above herself, and she never faltered in her promise to spend her life devoted to service. And as we've prayed every day sitting in this place that Queen Elizabeth I may always incline to thy will and walk in thy way, so I believe we can now pray with confidence that after this life she may attain everlasting joy and felicity through Jesus Christ our Lord. Queen Elizabeth II spent her life building relationships in our nation, our Commonwealth, and across the world. In her achievements, we can all take comfort and know that as the crown passes to our new king, we will have the example of her legacy to unite us in loyal allegiance to her successor, King Charles III. God save the King.
Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to pay a tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on behalf of my constituents in Wallasey, who are in shock and mourning today. One of the things that strikes everyone contemplating this sad news is the sheer span of the length of time of her reign, the longest ever reign in UK history. Someone who lived through an era of profound upheaval and change, but who represented continuity and certainty amidst the tumult. When she was born, it's hard to remember that in 1926 only 10 women had ever been elected into this place, into this House of Commons. And at that time, women did not exercise the vote on the same terms as men. Thankfully, that has now changed, though I always say that work to achieve equality is never done. But she, as the mother of the house said earlier, led just by example. She led by being. She demonstrated as our head of state, who was clearly, obviously, a woman and a wife and a mother, how possible it was, even if that had been granted to her by fate, by destiny, to combine the roles of the pressure that she had on her with a family life. Her coronation was the first to be televised. Now the monarchy has a presence on social media platforms seen by billions. Her reign has seen the transition from empire to Commonwealth, from conflict to peace in Northern Ireland, but also from complacency to climate emergency, which demonstrates to all of us that we have much to do and many problems to confront us. The values she personified are clear and have been clear from the comments in this House. Utter commitment to public service and duty. A woman who dedicated her life to the service of our nation. And when she said at 21 in a broadcast, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service," that is a vow that she delivered, as we now know, faithfully right up until the very end. She personified wisdom and experience, but she did, as the Honourable Lady who's just spoken has just said, have that twinkle in her eye. Whenever you were waiting in line to meet Her Majesty, you could see the twinkle and it put you at ease. She first visited Wirral in 1957, but during my time in this house, she first came to Birkenhead when she opened the Europa Pool in 1996, and finally came to Wallasey for the second time in 2011 to open the newly rebuilt floral pavilion in New Brighton. Thousands upon thousands of official duties, many thousands of my constituents looked forward to her visits and have fond memories of them. She was always interested, always engaging, and always smiling and reassuring when she interacted with people who lined the routes to see her on these fantastic occasions. So her loss will be mourned. It's a terrible but inevitable loss. She left us in a place where we know we can survive the transition because of the strength she gave to the institution. So may she rest in peace, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we all wish the greatest condolences to the royal family who are going through such terrible loss now. And we look forward to supporting the new king as much as we've supported our now sadly lost Queen Elizabeth II.
It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm filled with great sadness as I rise to pay tribute to the life and the memory of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Our thoughts are with the royal family and who have lost a mother, a grandmother, and of course a great-grandmother. Her Majesty lived an extraordinary life of service, and the touching tributes that we have already heard from Right Honourable and Honourable members so far, along with the outpouring of emotion from across the world, including from my own constituents in Bromsgrove District, reflect the deep affection and love in which she was held. For over 7 decades, she was a source of our strength and comfort, a representative of our closest held values and beliefs, a defender of faith, and an embodiment of the very best of public service and duty. She was our North Star, a symbol of strength in difficult times. To put it simply, she was our Queen. Right Honourable and Honourable members, many have shared their times of when they were privileged to meet Her late Majesty. And I was able to do so on many occasions, and I always welcomed the huge wisdom she would share, the advice, and of course the good humour. I will never forget during the occasion of the final Privy Council meeting of 2017, as the formalities ended, Her Majesty suddenly said, "Gin and tonic, anybody?" and proceeded to press a buzzer. And with that, her staff promptly burst through the doors of the 1844 room in Buckingham Palace, armed with trays of G&T and nibbles. Now, I'm not much of a G&T drinker myself, but I certainly was not going to turn down the opportunity of enjoying one with Her late Majesty. I later learned that she'd like to make the last Privy Council meeting of the year extra special, so that she could wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Madam Deputy Speaker, our country faces immense challenges at home and abroad, and the person that has always been there is there no longer. However, in the wake of this terrible loss, it is an opportunity for parliamentarians from across this House to renew their commitment to the values that were embodied by Her late Majesty: public service, duty, the national interest. If we can leave this place having achieved but the smallest fraction of what Her late Majesty achieved, our country would be the better for it. After a lifetime of service, Her late Majesty is now at rest. May she rest in peace, and God save the King.
Liz Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Dy'r Pwylefarydd. And on behalf of Plaid Cymru, I would like to offer my sincerest sympathies and condolences to Her Majesty the Queen's children and her extended family as they come to terms with their grief. Queen Elizabeth II has been a constant presence throughout all our lives. She stood as a figure of stability in a world that is changing at a rapid and sometimes frightening pace. The loss of the continuity that Her Majesty embodied is a source of sorrow and anxiety for people across the world. Up to her final days, she conducted her duties with an extraordinary dedication that has been an inspiration for so many of us. Her values of duty, service, reconciliation and forgiveness are values that the people of Wales hold very dear. In Wales, we respect people who embody that sense of dedication to society and to public service, who put their public duty first. Her Majesty the Queen personified that duty for so many people for so many years. And Her Majesty had a canny ability to put people at ease in the midst of palace formality. When I was fortunate to be appointed to the Privy Council 3 years ago, I remember being nervous, being intimidated by the protocols and the rules that govern interactions with the royal family. Your mind, as it would do, tots up an infinite checklist of everything that could possibly go wrong. And what struck me was something she said. She said, "You may well be worrying that you'll do something wrong or in the wrong order. Don't worry. Whatever could possibly go wrong, I've seen it all before. There's nothing that you could do that would shock me now." Even among all the pomp and ceremony, there was that characteristic warmth and courtesy to the Queen. And Her Majesty was a magnificent role model for older women across the world. Historically, of course, older women have disappeared from public life. The Queen was a constant, visible figure throughout the 70 years of her reign. From historic buildings and charities to football, she always showed an interest in Wales. People of all walks of Welsh life have been touched by the Queen's keen interest and constant support of Welsh organisations. She attended every official opening of the Senedd and showed due respect for Wales's nationhood and our growing democracy. She was patron to organisations as diverse as the Royal Welsh Agricultural Society, the Football Association of Wales, Cardiff Royal Infirmary and the Welsh Pony and Cob Society. Her love of horses, from thoroughbreds to native ponies, shone through. You see it in those sparkling smiles. Everyone in public life knows you have a public smile, but the photos with the horses, that was her real smile. We now see one era drawing to a close and a new one at its very beginning. For now we will say, Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much, Your Majesty. Cwsg Ma'n Hedd, may she rest in peace. Bendith Dew ar y brenin. God's blessing on the King.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to share gratitude for the life of Her late Majesty the Queen, share sadness for her, especially for her family, and also sadness for the country and the world at the loss of the greatest statesman of our time. I also want to mark my own personal gratitude for the advice that Her Majesty gave me, for her role in particular, as has been mentioned by the most recent former Prime Minister, for her role in bringing the country together and giving hope in dark times during the pandemic. And I'd also add for taking the rare step of going public with her health status when declaring that she'd taken a vaccination and showing further leadership. She was much loved, of course, and loved across my West Suffolk constituency, but perhaps no more anywhere than in Newmarket, which she visited so often. Newmarket, of course, is the jewel in the crown of horse racing, certainly domestically and probably across the world. And on her many, many visits there, she showed that she could walk with sovereigns and the general public alike. She visited many times. It was where I first met her. The first time I met her, I was lucky to be with my small daughter, who handed her a posy, and it's my daughter's first memory, and no doubt will be an abiding one for the rest of her life. And it reminds me of the many times that I've seen Her Majesty meeting the public and been impressed and inspired by her sheer ability to ensure that each person she meets understands that she is focused entirely on them and she listened so well to them, knowing no doubt that for each person she met, it was a moment that that person would remember for the rest of her life. Her fortitude at continuing to do that well into her 90s was incredible to behold. Now, we in Newmarket are not always known for our humility, but the one thing we do know is that the reason that Her Majesty loved to come to Newmarket was not because of us two-legged beings, but because of the four-legged beings. And her love of horse racing was perhaps her greatest love outside her duty to her family and her country. The twinkle that we've heard so much of and the genuine smile that came on her face was probably broadest when at a racecourse, as she demonstrated in what was probably her last social public occasion at Ascot. I remember it particularly at a visit when she came to open the National Horse Racing Museum, which is in Newmarket. She went down the line of dignitaries, she went down and met the public, she gave them her customary focus, but she was clearly doing her duty because the museum is full of retired racehorses, and it was only when she got to the horses that she really lit up. This was Her Majesty at her best. We have lost a great servant. She is replaced by another great servant of our nation. God save the King.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think what's been so remarkable in the words that have been spoken since Her Majesty's Queen Elizabeth's death is just how many people's lives she touched. It wasn't just simply the length of her reign, nor her complete commitment to duty, but I think it was her character and the way in which she did her work that meant that she was loved by so many and will be missed by us all. Many of us here today had the privilege of meeting her and talking to her, and like the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green, I too had the drinks at Christmas and wished I knew a bit more about cocktails, but went for the safe gin and tonic at the time. I want to remember her at the start of her reign and then recall two of the times when I was with her. I was 8 when Queen Elizabeth was crowned. Just to say to my right honourable friend, the member for Derby South, we were still rationed in those days, if she remembers. So the reason that the chocolate was so welcome was it was rationed chocolate. We didn't care about the eggs and the meat being rationed, but the chocolate being rationed was really important. We didn't have a television in our home, so we huddled and crowded around a small black and white television in one of our neighbours' houses. But I really remember seeing the coach, seeing the glittering jewels on her crown, and seeing her stunning white dress. It was simply like a fairy tale, a Cinderella or a Snow White coming true. And that magical moment of beauty, hope, and goodness has stayed with me all through her long reign. There were two occasions when I met her that also remain strong in my memory. Firstly, in the early 80s, when I was leader in Islington, the Queen visited Sadler's Wells, and we laid on a session for her with a group of old age pensioners, women, living in Finsbury, and we were running there a Keep Fit dancing class under the tutorship of Sadler's Wells teachers. The Queen walked into the room, and the warmth of her smile as she entered the room and the utter joy of the women at being watched by Her Majesty and the calm way that she put them at ease when she talked to them was just simply brilliant. And for the Queen, I think it was probably just another day, but for the women, it was probably one of the most eventful days in their lives. The second was when the Queen came to visit Barking and Dagenham in July 2015, when she was nearly 90, to mark the 50th anniversary of the creation of the borough. She spent almost the whole day there, opening a community centre, lunching in a local theatre. She visited schools and she watched a swimming display. Thousands of my constituents came out to see her, and many met her, and she did enjoy a rapturous reception. And the fact that she's chosen to spend so much of her time with us on what must have been a tiring day, she was getting on for 90, demonstrates, I think, her total commitment to duty, to us, to her people. And among the sea of Union Jacks that met her, I just remember the placards which said, "Welcome our Queen, we love you." Madam Deputy Speaker, at a time of constant change, Queen Elizabeth II gave us stability. At a time of uncertainty, tension and conflict, she always provided a path to reconciliation. And as a nation and community, she provided leadership that brought recognition, respect and status and love to all of Great Britain and all of our people. We will miss her.
Nigel Adams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is with great sadness that I rise to speak in the tributes to Her late Majesty the Queen, not only on my behalf, but on behalf of my constituents in Selby and Ainsty. The news the whole nation had been dreading brings the reign of the longest-serving monarch in British history to an end. As we've heard, as a child, she was not expected to be Queen, but her destiny and that of our nation changed when her father acceded to the throne as King George VI. She, as we have heard, as a 21-year-old young woman, pledged to live a life of service. There can be no one anywhere, Madam Deputy Speaker, that can say she did not deliver on that pledge. I vividly recall the celebrations for the Queen's Silver Jubilee in my village and across the nation. It's also incredible that she has also celebrated golden, diamond and platinum jubilees. Her life spanned some of the most amazing milestones over the last century, from the discovery of penicillin, the moon landings, and the invention of the World Wide Web. She was also a monarch that circumnavigated the world, visiting hundreds of countries, including those Commonwealth countries which she held with such affection. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the Queen also visited Selby in my constituency alongside her beloved husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. This was in 1969 when they came to present Maundy money to 43 men and 43 women at Selby Abbey. 10,000 people lined the town streets that day to welcome and catch a glimpse of their monarch. Now, like many honourable and right honourable members, I've had the privilege of meeting the Queen both times at the Palace, and I cannot tell you, Madam Deputy Speaker, how nervous I was as we lined up to meet her. All my nerves were becalmed, however, once I'd been greeted by that beautifully warm smile and her welcoming words. That warmth, that smile, is what's comforted our nation over the decades, through good and challenging times. The word constant has been widely used, and that's exactly what her late Majesty was. It would be difficult to imagine life without her, and it feels like we've all lost a grandmother. My right honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, in his touching speech, referred to her late Majesty as Elizabeth the Great. He is absolutely right to do so. She was a truly great monarch, and in some ways, the greatest monarch. Her late Majesty was also a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with her family, especially with King Charles III, who succeeds her to the throne. And as my right honourable friend has also said, it is a tribute to her that we can say with great confidence, God save the King. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, we owe her late Majesty a great debt of gratitude. May God bless her and keep her. May she rest in peace. And if I may paraphrase a small bear from darkest Peru, Mom, thank you for everything.
Colm Eastwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The warm tributes that have already been paid to Queen Elizabeth II by honourable and right honourable members today tell their own story about the great respect and deep affection that so many from such diverse and different backgrounds had for her. It is an affection and a respect that transcends mere political difference and speaks to her position as a leader and an example of public service. As others have already said, the Queen was one of the most consequential civic figures of the last century. As political leaders came and went, as public opinion ebbed and flowed, she remained a constant, an unyielding and limitless source of strength and comfort for her people in times of national pride and sorrow. The scale of her reign, lasting more than 70 years, spanned the embers of conflict following the Second World War to the peace process between our islands and our peoples. During that time, she forged a legacy that will outlast all of us here. But I hope that lays the foundation for enduring relations between these islands, in spite of the challenges we now face. As leader of the SDLP, I had cause to meet with Queen Elizabeth on a number of occasions. Believe me when I say this, it is difficult to think of two people more divorced from each other in terms of background and aspiration. But in any dealings I had with her, I can only recount a person of great warmth, character, and an enduring passion for the interests and needs of people. That, I think, is the reason for the longevity of our support among the British people. But as a leader of Irish nationalism, I want to place on record my deep appreciation and respect for the Queen's role in forging new bonds of friendship between our islands and between our people. It is also easy to forget now, but she was also a victim of the conflict that the people of these islands were subjected to for 40 long years. I know that the murder of her cousin Lord Mountbatten in Mullaghmore
in August 1979 had a profound effect on her and on her extended family. She experienced the sharp pain of loss, but in common with the people of Ireland, she took risks for peace and played an enormous role in reconciling the traditions that share our islands. At no time was this more visible than during her 2011 visit to Ireland. I believe that Queen Elizabeth's visit to the Gardens of Remembrance in Dublin and the way she stretched herself to be an example of a good neighbour to Ireland in those moments contributed in a very significant way to healing the wounds of our past. Those couple of focal, those few words of Irish, Húchtarán agus a Cearda, President and friends, was a symbolic embrace of the Irish people, and it was deeply, deeply appreciated. The blessings of a long life doesn't make the burden of saying goodbye any lighter. My sincerest condolences are with the Queen's immediate family, with Right Honourable and Honourable members here today, and most particularly with those in Northern Ireland for whom she held a cherished place in their lives and in their hearts. I know how difficult it is to lose your hero, but there is comfort in the lasting legacy that she will leave, having helped shape our common history. The story of our peoples is fundamentally and inseparably intertwined. We all live in each other's shadow. I hope that we continue to build on the legacy that Queen Elizabeth II helped forge. May she rest in peace.
Order, just a reminder that the Speaker's guidance was 3 minutes in order to be able to get in as many people as possible. David Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as other Right Honourable and Honourable members have mentioned, it is impossible for virtually all of us and our constituents to remember a time when Her Majesty the Queen was not there. I was born a matter of weeks after she acceded to the throne, and throughout my life, and indeed all our lives, hers has been a continuous, reassuring presence, providing wise guidance for the country through good times and bad. She was both an anchor and a lodestone for our nation, and it is indeed hard to contemplate life without her. For 7 decades, she was there for us, and I think that many of us thought that she always would be. She had a rare, innate ability to generate affection, respect, and loyalty, not only from the people of this country, but from countless millions throughout the Commonwealth and beyond. Hers was arguably the most recognised face on the planet, and it's not only here that she will be missed, but in other lands across the world, even in the few countries that she never visited during her long reign. At the time of her Platinum Jubilee, the BBC broadcast a remarkable documentary called Elizabeth, the Unseen Queen, which was part narrated by the Queen herself. And in the documentary, she spoke the following words of an Australian Aboriginal proverb. "We are all visitors to this time, this place. We are just passing through. Our purpose here is to observe, to learn, to grow, to love, and then we return home." And Madam Deputy Speaker, while we and our constituents feel the most profound grief at her passing, and our mourning will undoubtedly continue long beyond her funeral, we must find comfort in the knowledge that our Queen, strong in the Christian faith that sustained her throughout her life, has returned home and is at peace. God bless the lovely memory of Her Majesty. God save the King.
Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise at a time of great sadness for our country, and I do so on behalf of my constituents in Doncaster North, and I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, I speak for you and your constituents in Doncaster Central, indeed right across Doncaster. I would say also, Madam Deputy Speaker, the House has been at its best today with some wonderful speeches and memories of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. I was Leader of the Opposition, as the House will know, and I know that it is noted that the Queen experienced 15 Prime Ministers. I think perhaps it has been lost count of how many leaders of the opposition she went through, which says something about leaders of the opposition, perhaps. But it is in that spirit and my experience that I want to talk briefly to the House, because I think one thing that has come through so much since Her Majesty's passing last night is the words public service. And I want to reflect on some qualities, some extraordinary qualities that she showed in terms of public service. First of all, her ability to bring people together and unify our country. I was at the state banquet in 2014 for the President of Ireland. A state banquet attended by the late Martin McGuinness. It showed extraordinary selflessness, courage, and an ability to heal that Her Majesty invited Martin McGuinness, given the history of what happened to Lord Mountbatten. But it was the person that she was. Her duty to our country, her duty to bring people together came first. Secondly, I think she taught us about kindness in leadership. The Right Honourable Member for Chingford, who is not in his place, talked about his experience when he was deposed as leader of the opposition. I was deposed by the British people rather than my party. I should say that to the House that as my career nosedived, my wife's took off, and she became a High Court judge in 2019 and became a Dame. And so we were both invited to the palace to meet Her Majesty. And Her Majesty fixed me with her gaze as we saw each other and said, "Oh, it's you," she said. "What are you doing here?" knowing full well why I was there. And we had a wonderful conversation. And there she was at 93, still full of vim, vigour, and humour. And there is a lesson for us all in the kindness she showed to me and to other members of this House. And thirdly, I want to say something about her sense of humour, because I go back to a time in 2008 when I had been recently appointed the Secretary of State for Climate Change, and I went to my first ever Privy Council meeting, and Her Majesty was reading out laws that were being passed. And as she did so, she paused for a moment and said, because she was having trouble reading, and she said, "Yes, it's these new long life light bulbs that we've introduced." And she fixed me with a beady gaze and a twinkle in her eye, and I smiled. And that was a sense of humour that she showed. She was an extraordinary monarch, but I do also want to say a word about King Charles III. And here, again, I speak on behalf of my constituents. He has been an extraordinary warrior on the issue of the environment, long before it was fashionable. And when I was Climate Change Secretary, I always thought of him as an extraordinary national asset on this issue, and he remains so. But he's not just a fighter for big causes, he is also someone, and here he has inherited this from his mother, of extraordinary kindness, generosity and compassion. We see it in his work to heal social divisions in our country, but I've also seen it in my constituency, which was hit by floods in both 2007 and 2019. And on both occasions, including on the first, when part of my constituency was still underwater, King Charles III came to see us, to see my constituents, to talk to them, to be with them, including on the second occasion, just before Christmas, because he knew that his presence at this time of anguish and grief and anxiety for my constituents would make an enormous difference to them. And indeed, it did so. I say to the House, we have lost an extraordinary monarch who has had an extraordinary and distinguished reign for 7 decades. She is followed by someone who I know will live up to all of the hopes of our country, will bring that same sense of unity, that sense of compassion, and that sense of public service. Long live the King.
Chris Crayley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to be able to participate in this solemn occasion, one that we all knew would happen, but one we all really in our heart of hearts hoped wouldn't. It is a day of mourning for all of us individually, for us collectively as a House, and for the whole nation. And not just the whole nation. I was struck last night to see a picture of an American baseball diamond with the teams lined up in a minute's silence in recognition of the loss of the Queen. And of course she was a global figure. I remember when I hosted the Global Law Summit in 2015 and the Queen very kindly hosted a reception at the Palace. The US Justice Secretary, a powerful man in that country, coming up to me after he'd been introduced to the Queen going, I feel like a 9-year-old, it's just amazing, I'm here, it's extraordinary. And that's what the world thinks of her, thought of her, and that's why they will all be mourning with us now. And I have a particular reason for mourning, 2 reasons actually. My constituency is one of the places she came to every year as a committed racing watcher to attend the Derby, and she will be much missed there in the future. And I had an email from a constituent this morning saying we will miss now that moment every year when she drove up the road at the end of our street and we could all see her and wave as she went past. She'll be missed by everybody in Epsom. But I'll particularly miss her because I had the privilege of serving for 5 years, first as her Lord Chancellor and then as Lord President of her Council. And in those 2 roles, one gets to spend not as much time as the Prime Minister, but a considerable amount of time with her. And she was an extraordinary, welcoming, kind, smart person. I remember the moment when the current Archbishop of Canterbury was sworn in. And we've been through the formula that you go through on these occasions. And then, when we're finished, she and the Archbishop, who used to work for Shell in Nigeria, embarked in the most extraordinary conversation about the politics of Nigeria. And she knew it inside out. She was incredibly knowledgeable about what was going on in this country and elsewhere. She was incredibly welcoming for all those of us who've had the privilege of spending time working with her in our various capacities. We know she was a kind person, or a warm person, always welcoming, always that twinkle in the eye that the Right Honourable Member referred to a moment ago. Always a light-hearted conversation, sometimes about great issues, sometimes about simple matters like how you manage all the dogs at Sandringham at Christmas time. I remember so many occasions going in with this incredible global figure and being made to feel welcome, being made to feel that she was interested in what I and we were doing, and to feel incredibly proud that she was our monarch. And I join the Right Honourable Member in wishing all the very best to King Charles III. He has had a long apprenticeship. He will, I believe, be a great monarch, and I know everyone in this House will wish him all the very best for what is a very difficult time for him. We'll also want to extend their condolences to all members of the royal family who've lost their grandmother and their great-grandmother. It is a very sad occasion for them. But I particularly today think back to one conversation I had with her. We were, before a Privy Council meeting, talking about the way technology is changing the world. And I said, you know, it's extraordinary, the world's changing so fast, who knows where we'll be in 30 years' time? And she said, the only thing I know is I won't be there. And sadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, she isn't, and we will miss her.
Hilary Bell.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise on behalf of my constituents in Leeds Central as we together mourn the Queen's passing, offer our heartfelt condolences to His Majesty the King and to the royal family on their private grief borne so publicly, and to mark an extraordinary life. It was at my first meeting of the Privy Council that I came to understand that the Queen was determined that things should be done correctly. We were waiting outside the door and one of the footmen opened it to see what was going on, and as he closed it, he turned to his colleague and said, "She's moving the footstools again." To which he received the reply, "She's the Queen. If she wants to move the footstools, she can move the footstools. Now, hers was a life that above all else embodied constancy. We have known no other, and we feel the Queen's passing so keenly precisely because she was always here. Her devotion to duty, to service, and to representing our country ran like an unbroken thread through the decades and through each of our lives. Like the passing of time and the changing of the seasons, she was always here. And although, as we have heard, so many things changed during her reign, she did not change. Above the noisy clamour of politics and public debate, she carried on and showed us what service means, carried out with grace and with humour. And now the day has come, as we long feared but knew it would, that she is no longer here. And as the people of Leeds and of Yorkshire and of the country come to terms with their deep sense of loss at this moment in the history of our nation, our United Kingdom, let us give thanks for her uniquely long and well-lived life. And just as faith, hope and love abide, so will our memories of the Queen, her constancy, her service and her profound sense of duty. Thank you for everything that you did, Ma'am, and may you rest in peace eternal.
Andrew Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I had the very great privilege of serving as the Vice-Chamberlain of Her Majesty's household between July 2018 and April 2019, a role and a title given to the fourth most senior government whip. It's a role that the Right Honourable Member for Derby South spoke about earlier in her fantastic contribution. It's a role that most Honourable and Right Honourable Members don't know even exists, apart from when they see one of the government whips stood at the bar of the House wearing a tailcoat and carrying what appears to be a snooker cue. It's also a role that only people hear about when they realise that somebody has to be held hostage at the palace before Her Majesty would come to Parliament for the state opening. However, the role is much more than that, in that alongside your day-to-day activities in the Whip's office, you would write a daily note to Her Majesty, keeping her updated with parliamentary business, giving her all the gossip, and then going to Parliament to discuss those matters. I'm just very glad that, unlike the Right Honourable Member for Derby South, the Chief Whip nor the Prime Minister ever read my notes. Given my period in office coincided with some of the most acrimonious Brexit debates, a confidence vote in our Prime Minister, my Right Honourable friend the Member for Maidenhead, and the 2019 vote of confidence, there are very few issues Her Majesty and I have not discussed. Indeed, my final week in office as the Vice-Chamberlain included nude protesters gluing themselves to the glass in the public gallery and the chamber being suspended after water started pouring through the ceiling into the press gallery. Perhaps it was quite symbolic as to how broken our Parliament was at that time. However, despite this being an immensely stressful and politically charged period, on every occasion I met Her Majesty, I found her calm, warm and reassuring. Like all who have spoken today, I was struck by her interest in current events and her lifelong service to our nation. As our longest reigning monarch and the world's longest serving head of state, she had an incredible insight into current affairs and was a great symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. I remember vividly a discussion we had about the online abuse that many members across the House face on social media. Her Majesty recalled a conversation she'd had with Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, and talked knowledgeably about the subject, despite social media being something most people in the 90s wouldn't know or care anything about. We also discussed interviews that she'd watched on the BBC News at 10 the night before, demonstrating that Her Majesty's desire to stay on top of current affairs stretched well beyond the papers she received in her daily red box. All these meetings took place with Her Majesty standing throughout and were often sandwiched between multiple other official engagements that she was undertaking. I last met Her Majesty the Queen on the 19th of July at her last ever Privy Council meeting, when I was sworn into the Privy Council and presented with a Bible, which I carry with me today. I believe that made me the 1,336th person and final person to be sworn into Her late Majesty's Privy Council. It is an incredible honour as a minister for the past 5 years to get to meet a remarkable, caring, informed and witty monarch who's overseen huge change during her reign but never stopped working day in, day out for our country. And it is an incredible honour for me as a Lancastrian MP to see the love felt towards Her Majesty Duke of Lancaster by so many of my constituents in Pendle, who I will be joining with in remembering and celebrating her life over this period of national mourning. May she rest in peace, and God save the King.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I never had the pleasure of meeting the late Queen personally, but I have met her son, the new King, on several occasions, and I can testify personally to his deep love for the Highlands. And I know that my constituents in Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey will want to join me in holding him in our thoughts as he deals with this most personal of losses, that of his mother. But of course, as we know, the late Queen was also a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and she acceded to the throne as a young woman at the age of 25 and was an inspiration and icon for many young women, and as we've also heard this morning, became an inspiration and an icon for many older women too. She was someone, as we can see from the tributes internationally, who was respected and admired far and wide. The vast majority of my constituents, whether they be monarchists or Republican or anything in between, have never known a time when she was not our head of state. Our sympathy goes to her family and all of those who are so deeply affected by her passing.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And on behalf of the constituents of Harwich and North Essex, I rise to pay tribute to Her late Majesty, whose whole life was the greatest example of public service we shall ever witness, whose kind heart, sharp intellect, huge wisdom was such a gift to the nation, and who had love in her soul for everyone and a serenity which even now calms the nation in these troubled times. She inspired so many good causes. I single out one, the Commonwealth. In 1952, a mere 8 nations, which she led from being an emerging relic of a lost empire to become a network of nations representing 2.5 billion people in the network world we now live in. Just one of her achievements, but what an achievement. What a legacy for future generations, including, may I say, the Commonwealth Youth Orchestra, whose foundation she supported, about which she spoke to me with such passion, knowing that we both had such interest in music. Her devotion brought her to every corner of the kingdom where she would show her humour and humanity. When in 2004 she came to Harwich to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the town charter, when Ivan Henderson was still the Member of Parliament, her programme included seeing the historic carvings in the town jail. But when the late Andy Morrison, the Mayor, announced, "You will now be taken to the jail, Your Majesty," a pall fell over the royal party. So he attempted to rephrase the invitation. But Prince Philip just retorted, "That wasn't much better." And she threw back her head and roared with laughter. Later that day, as she stepped into the crowd on Harwich Quay, she said to the Mayoress, Pam Morrison, "My dear, don't let me miss any children." A 3-year-old boy was duly lifted over the barrier, who gave his flowers to the Mayoress at first. But Her Majesty, unfazed, chatted to the boy and charmed him, and he saw her take the little bunch of flowers which he had given her into her own hands, and she carried them for the rest of the tour. So she combined global leadership, such principle and dedication, with such humanity and care. She has gone to the light, who some call God, who inspires us all. God rest her soul. May he comfort all those who were closest to her. God save the King.
Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is an honour to be able to pay tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and to offer my condolences and those of all of my constituents to King Charles and the whole of the royal family as they face their personal loss. Honourable and right honourable members have rightly praised Her Majesty's admirable work ethic, her sense of duty, which has never wavered, and her unparalleled dedication to public service. Her Majesty served us right until the very end, forever committed to her people and her country. She lived and symbolised the very best of our constitutional system, the value of a royal family, what it gives to our country and the part that they play in our national life. One of the proudest days of my life was when my dad was awarded an OBE at Buckingham Palace. My whole family, we just could not get over that we would get the chance to hang out in the Queen's house. On that day, it fell to the Queen's daughter, the Princess Royal, to hand out the honours, but the whole occasion was made magical because it followed precisely the exact example of the Queen herself. And I will also never forget arriving in this place for the very first time in 2010, standing in front of the Speaker's chair, taking hold of this House's copy of the Holy Quran, upon which I swore my loyalty to Her Majesty the Queen as one of this House's first ever female Muslim members of Parliament. Her relationship with Birmingham was strong, and in return we Brummies had a deep affection for her and gratitude for the time that she devoted to us in the 70 years of her reign. Over the years she visited Villa Park, the Bull Ring, many of our railway stations, the NEC, the International Convention Centre, Pebble Mill and the Hippodrome. And of course, we have just hosted the Commonwealth Games, an important moment for our city that has such a deep connection with the Commonwealth and which is inextricably linked with the Queen herself. Like so many thousands of Brummies, as much as I am a child of Birmingham, of England and of Britain, I am also a child and grandchild of the Commonwealth. Millions of British citizens have a similar family history, making them a part of the Commonwealth family, and we recognise Her Majesty as the loving matriarch of the Commonwealth, its guardian and its guiding light. Her commitment to the Commonwealth and her championing of it recognised and respected our heritage. She gave institutional and spiritual meaning and the heart and soul of belonging to those of us who are citizens of our great nation, equal before the laws of our land, but who do not have centuries of birthright claim upon these our islands, and we thank her for it. For me, her Christian faith also is something that always stood out. She was a committed Christian, as we know, Supreme Governor of the Church of England. It might surprise some that her commitment to her Christian faith could mean so much to those of us who practice, observe and belong to other faith communities. But in a speech at Lambeth Palace to mark her Diamond Jubilee, the Queen said, and I quote, "The concept of our established church is occasionally misunderstood and I believe commonly underappreciated. Its role is not to defend Anglicanism to the exclusion of other religions. Instead, the Church has a duty to protect the free practice of all faiths in this country." She was defender of the faith, but she was a queen for those of us with other faiths, and indeed for those of none. May God make it easy for her. May he give her loved ones strength. And if I may offer this House an Islamic verse which Muslims recite when someone dies, and which I hope will resonate with the Queen's Christian faith too. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. To God we belong, and to God we all return.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise on behalf of, to make my own tribute, but also on behalf of the constituents of North East Hertfordshire in Royston, Baldock, Buntingford and Letchworth. The Queen was very much loved and admired in our area, a remarkable woman and a wonderful head of state. She knew our area well from visiting her mother's family, who live in a village near Hitchin, St Paul's Walden. We were lucky that the Queen was able to be with us for some of our most important events. She opened the new North Hertfordshire Leisure Centre at Letchworth Garden City, and later, in my first year as MP in 1993, she came to open a new housing development at Beach Hill and a sheltered housing scheme at Tabor Court in Letchworth. And Letchworth was also proud that she chose the Marmot pram as the baby carriage for the new king, made in Letchworth. On these occasions, what struck me was that the Queen was able to put people at their ease and to get them to talk to her, and she was kindly and had that dry sense of humour. On the sense of humour, I do remember one Privy Council meeting when the country was having difficulties, similar but at a different period to those that the Right Honourable Member for Derby South mentioned with the European Union. But at this particular Privy Council meeting, she approved the High Hedges Order for Guernsey. And then afterwards, she said with a twinkle in her eye, "Well, I'm so pleased we've sorted out those high hedges in Guernsey. Is there anything else going on?" People in North East Hertfordshire loved the Queen, and we will miss her. Our thoughts are with the royal family, and long live the King.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think there have been some wonderful tributes to Her late Majesty the Queen. Particularly, I just want to comment on the contribution from my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Ladywood, who talked about the Commonwealth and the importance of faith to the late Queen. I think this is my opportunity just to say a few words on behalf of my constituents in Hull North. I was very pleased indeed that the Leader of the Opposition, my right honourable friend, referred to the words of the adopted son of Kingston upon Hull, the poet Philip Larkin. He penned those words 45 years ago for the Silver Jubilee celebrations. And as with all great poets, the words resonate as much on this day as they did in 1977. And I'm just going to repeat them. In times when nothing stood but worsened or grew strange, there was one constant good. She did not change. Now, my city of Kingston upon Hull has a rebellious history with the monarchy, slamming the city gates against the king in the Civil War. But the city took Queen Elizabeth to our hearts, and I would say we were very firmly in the royalist camp during this second Elizabethan age. Her Majesty visited the city many times and met the people of the city. During her reign, she was in Hull on some of the most important days in the life of the city and the region. These include the opening of the iconic Humber Bridge in 1981, celebrating the city's 700th birthday in 1999, and visiting Hull in 2017 when we were the UK City of Culture. Her first visit to the city was actually to Hull Royal Infirmary in 1957, and she came again 50 years later to open the Queen's Cancer Centre at Castle Hill Hospital in 2009. The city will miss her. And although the Sovereign's passing is a historic moment for the United Kingdom and our Commonwealth, and for many others around the world, at this time we must remember, above all else, that a family has lost a beloved mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother. And like many others, this loss to the nation resonates very personally with the loss of one's own parents or grandparents. And in particular, I remember my Auntie Betty, a staunch royalist who loved the Queen and was also born in the same year as the Queen, 1926. So on behalf of the people of Hull, my thoughts and prayers are with the royal family at this saddest of times. I also want to express condolences on behalf of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which I sit as a member. And although there is great sadness at this time, let us also remember a long life of service, so well lived, devoted to this nation, a life that should be celebrated. The Queen was a member of that greatest generation who herself, as we've heard, served in uniform in World War II, helping to secure our democracy's survival against tyranny. This was also a Queen who embraced change throughout her life and saw us into the digital age. And I just wanted to end by saying it was a special honour to be sworn in as a Privy Councillor over Zoom during the COVID pandemic. So I didn't have any of the worries about the footstool and falling over. And so the Queen was on a very large screen in front of me. She looked entirely at ease and was taking this new technology completely in her stride, perhaps rather more so than the Lord President of the Council at that time, the Right Honourable Member for North East Somerset. So to conclude, like the vast majority of Britons alive today, I have known no other monarch. But sadly, we now have the point where change has come, and we, alongside the condolences to the royal family, we look to the new King Charles III. One era is ending, a new one is beginning. Queen Elizabeth II would want us to go forward as a great nation in all our faiths and beliefs, proving that she was never mistaken in hers. God save the King.
So Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.